I was looking for a big piece of wood to make a table for Stuart. This old oak coffee table should do nicely. It's a bit damaged on the top, but I can get around that. It was covered in a thick polyurethane varnish, which was a devil to get off. Fortified by numerous cups of tea from my trusty old Kelly kettle. I needed some sturdy strips of oak to make the A-frames, and this old oak dining table will do the job. Again, it's a bit stained and scratched, but that doesn't matter because all the brown's got to come off anyway. After dismantling the table, I shall saw the top into suitable sized strips before I clean them up. Here I'm just laying out the pieces. First, a couple of thicker pieces which will need to be cut to length. And then all the cleaned up strips of oak for the A-frames. Those thicker pieces will act as supports for the A-frames, as you'll see later on. I want a nice square edge to the table, so I'll have to saw off the original shaped moulding. I give the tabletop another couple of sands with 120 and then 240 grit sandpaper. Here I'm just taking off the sharp edges of the pieces of wood by planing a 45-degree chamfer just a little bit. I'm just laying out the A-frame pieces to get the angles right and to mark the position of the mortise slots. All the screw holes in the table are drilled with this special bit which has a counter bore on it to make a little hole for the screw head to disappear down into, which we can later cover up with a wooden plug. And now that the screw heads are safely out of sight, we can cover them up with these little wooden plugs. I've shown you how to make these in some of my other videos, but essentially it's a piece of oak cut into the shape of a circular plug, but with the grain running across it, so you can try and match it up with the grain of the wood where you're putting it into. And here we use the mortise gauge to mark out the mortise. It's a lovely old vintage tool made of rosewood and brass. It has two tiny sharp spikes which you can set to the width of your desired mortise and then use it to score two parallel lines in the wood to show you where to cut. I use a fine cut saw and a chisel to cut off the excess wooden pegs down to the level of the wood and then finish it off with sandpaper. I'm just putting the leg supports on temporarily. I shall have to take them off again to make the holes for the leg supports. This is just for measuring up and getting the holes drilled. The table legs angle out, and so obviously the mortise slots have to be cut at an angle. I take the bulk of the wood out of the mortise slot with a drill and then finish it off with a chisel. I need to make sure the drill goes through at the correct angle, so I've built a jig to help. I've turned the sound effects mic off because for some reason I was getting a lot of wind rumble, goodness knows why, inside the workshop. Anyway, you can see that the jig is holding the piece of wood at just the right angle, so the vertical drill press comes straight in through the wood at an angle. I drill the holes as close together as possible, overlapping, so there's not too much wood for the chisel to chipple out. I use two different size chisels, a wider one for the edges and then a narrow one just the width of the slot to do the ends, always remembering that the slot is at an angle and so therefore I must hold the chisels at a corresponding angle when I'm cutting with them. The leg support pieces with the angled mortise slots now cut into them can finally be glued and screwed into place on the bottom of the tabletop. As before, I'll put little wooden plugs in on top of the screw heads to hide them. And we can now start measuring up the long support strut which goes between the bottom rails of the A-frames. I give the strut a final clean up with the jack plane and then chamfer off all four corners at 45 degrees just to make it feel a bit nicer to handle. I'm just double checking the angle of the legs because obviously the tenons on the end of the strut have got to be cut at an angle to accommodate the splay of the legs. And then using the mitre gauge, I make sure that the tenons are marked up on the ends of the strut at the proper angle. when the shoulder line is all marked up, I use this mortise gauge to mark out the thickness of the tenon. I want it to be a good strong tenon, so I use about a third of the thickness of the wood. We'll just go back briefly to the A-frame leg supports and trim off all the little wooden plugs we put in on top of the screw heads. And now back to the bracing strut. I saw the waist wood off, making sure that the shoulders are at the proper angle as shown by the pencil lines. And now if we offer the bracing strut up to the leg A-frame, you'll see that the angle of the shoulders of the tenon exactly matches the angle of the bottom rail. We can now use the same jig, because it's of course the same angle, to drill holes for the mortise in the cross rails. These will of course be drilled out and then finished with a chisel in the same way as the previous mortises were. And when the mortise holes are all cleaned out and squared up, we can try the tenon into it and see that it all fits snugly together with the angles all lining up properly. I make a pencil mark on the tenon so that I know where to cut the hole for the peg. And then I drill a hole for the peg. I just drill a hole and then square it off where the pencil line is. I'll make the peg out of a piece of scrap oak using my spoke shave. I want to make a tapered peg which is round on one side and flat on the other, and then I need to shape a kind of knob on the end so that you can handle it easily. I'll use a pair of calipers to check that I've got the width of the peg right, and then I mark out the knob and the taper. I use a coping saw to cut the shape of the knob and the notch, and then I use a chisel to follow down the curve at the pointy end of the peg all the way down to where the knob handle is. And finally, I cut the taper using a tenon saw. I go back to the coping saw to finish off cutting the peg from the rest of the scrap wood. And then it's a case of using a whittling knife and a chisel to shape the knob in the way that I want to. and we can see how the peg fits snugly into the hole that we've made for it. The wedge shape of the peg forces the cross rail firmly onto the shoulders of the support rail, and the whole structure is very sturdy. So the table is structurally complete. We now need to finish it off with some further smoothing and finishing off the ends of the tenon on the support strut, and then give the whole thing several coats of beeswax and olive oil polish. I use a cabinet scraper to do the final smoothing. It's a thin piece of steel which is burnished to have a very sharp burr on one side, which acts as a tiny plane or chisel and takes tiny shavings of wood off the surface, leaving a really smooth surface behind. I go quickly round the edges of the table with a plane held at 45 degrees just to take the sharp corner off and make it feel a bit better. It just sort of finishes it off nicely. And one last little detail is to finish off the ends of the tenons on the support strut. And now it just remains to polish it all. I use an olive oil and beeswax polish which I make myself to an old medieval recipe. One of these days I'll do a little video to show you how I make it. And here's the finished table in what would be its natural environment in a field somewhere at a reenactment event. Just for interest's sake, I paired it up with a bench I made some time ago. And here it is with the armourer's box that I made for the same reenactor.